All right, hello everyone. So I'm here with Robin Collins, an American philosopher. He's a distinguished professor of philosophy and chair of the Department of Philosophy at Masai University in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. He's also one of the people most influential in my trend towards theism, and in my view, the most formidable defender of the fine-tuning argument today. Robin, welcome.
Thank you. I'm no longer chair, so there's been a rearrangement of things, but
Oh, okay.
chairs
Former
don't matter much anyhow. They're administrative positions.
Yeah. So before we talk about the fine-tuning argument, I want to talk about an interesting theodicy that you've developed called the connection-building theodicy. So do you want to just, for
Mhm.
those who don't know, lay out the basic idea of the connection-building theodicy?
The connection building theodicy, the basic idea is that um, this world, it's designed so that we can, first of all, help each other so we can contribute to somebody's welfare, or we can also do the opposite. And then by contributing to their welfare, we develop what I call positive connections with them of um, uh, appreciation, um, intimacy, and contribution. So there's certain kinds of positive connections. These are intrinsic goods, and they last forever into the afterlife. And so because they last forever, like in the afterlife, if I've helped you, let's say in wartime or something, and put my life on the line, that's something you will always remember in the afterlife, and it will build a connection between us. And people um, hold these connections. They intuitively think they are valuable. That's why often if somebody, like in once again the example of wartime, but there's many other examples, have somebody's helped them, they'll try to look for that person.
Yeah. So I
And
have a worry. I have a worry for the theodicy. I mean, I think it's going to be at least part of the right answer. That one of the reasons why there's so much evil in the world will have to do with the fact that it's conducive to uh, strengthening connections. Uh, you know, for the reasons you described. But one worry I have about this theodicy is, so if you look at the features of the world, so there are various broad features of the world that I think are poorly explained by the hypothesis of indifference, where the fact that the universe is finely tuned, the fact that there are psychophysical laws that also seem to produce this harmonious state, etc. But I think once you account for those, then there are several broad features, but once you have those in place, the hypothesis of indifference is a very good explanation of most of the specific evils. So, for instance, if you knew that once you have that in the background, it's pretty likely that there would be things like diseases and earthquakes and so on. Uh, and in contrast, while it's possible that those would be optimal for connection building, there are a whole range of things that might be ideal for connection building, a whole range of evils that would possibly build connection. And so it seems like, just given the sheer number of evils, like, diseases, each particular disease that causes suffering in its own unique way, given the sheer number of those that are all nicely explained by the hypothesis of indifference, the probability that each one of those would be optimal for connection building seems kind of low. What would you make an objection to an objection like that?
well, I mean, I don't, so each one of them is optimal. Then you're asking whether there's several kinds of things going on here. One is a problem of evil. You explain the global structure of the world, right, with your theodicy, why God would have created a world like this. And then if God creates a world like this world, all those different kinds of things are going to happen. And it's unclear whether all of them are optimal. What you'd want to say is a world like this is optimal for connection building. If the connection building theodicy was the only theodicy you were invoking, then you'd want to say this kind of world is that allows for those kinds of things to happen. So
Yeah.
that's one thing a theodicy does. Now you can hypothesize that each one is optimal, but then if you do that, your God would have to intervene at each point to stop each, you'd be hypothesizing, okay, if this is not optimal, God's somehow going to specially intervene to stop that particular evil, and that's going to run into its own problems. So you
Yeah.
also
So
have to ask, what are you demanding of your theodicy to explain? That's one line of answer to that sort of thing, each of the evils being optimal. On the indifference hypothesis, agreed, that explains if God were just indifferent, then you could explain the evils that you find in the world, because God doesn't particularly care whether good or bad things happens. But then I think you run into the problem, even with the fine tuning, of explaining why you have a cosmos that is fine tuned. Because if God were truly indifferent, then there'd be no reason for God to pick a universe that is, structured so that intelligent life could come about and that was highly discoverable versus any other option. And so then you're back to a kind of low probability, just like you have on the chance hypothesis, because what makes the fine tuning low, very improbable under the chance hypothesis is that under chance, there's no reason for a fine-tuned universe versus the vast, much larger number or proportion of universes that aren't fine-tuned.
Yeah, so I wasn't intending to suggest that there's sort of like an apathetic deistic God. What I was suggesting was, I think, sort of like, so there are these broad features of the world, like the fact that there are these predictable natural regularities, and that they produce evolution, and that this results in many of the evils in the world, that we're in an unstable world, with all sorts of natural disasters, and I think these specific features, it's hard to see why any particular one is conducive to connection. So I think I agree with you that the thing you want to do is try to argue that that not every individual evil is conducive to connection building, but rather that there are certain structural features of the world that are conducive
right.
to connection
That's right.
building.
That's what you want to argue, unless you want to argue why doesn't God intervene to stop those particular evils. So a particular evil occurs. Is that going to be productive to, is that optimal for connection building or not? I don't know whether that particular evil is, but you could ask if you thought that God was constantly intervening. Is there something in your room?
Oh no, sorry.
You're looking up.
Oh yeah,
So,
I do that sometimes during
okay.
interviews.
So if you thought that God was constantly intervening, arranging things so that every occurrence was optimal, um, then you would have that issue to explain why every one of those things is optimal. But even then, you might not know whether it is or not, because it's really hard. I mean, I couldn't purport to explain why everyone is optimal. That would just be a job that would be way beyond my pay grade, right?
Yeah.
I'm only going to be able to explain structural features, and then those particular kinds of evils that don't seem optimal, that like seem to lead to negative connections or do more harm than good. And in the paper I have on that, I go through all those, those general kinds of evils that would maybe seem to run against the connection building theodicy.
Yeah, I wonder if thinking about it this way helps diffuse one of the challenges that that you address in the paper. So one of the objections you address is that if we accept that all the evils, and this is a more general problem for the Odysseys, if we accept that all of the evils of the world are in some way conducive to the greater good, then there's a puzzle about why we should try to prevent evil things.
Right.
But if it's not true that every evil is conducive to the greater good, it's just that the broad structural features of the world are conducive to the greater good, and uh, the individual evils are sort of, we don't know if they're good or not. Then I think that would sort of serve to maybe diffuse that objection.
And we also do good things, try to prevent it, because that builds further connections
Yeah.
versus indifference. So indifference can have a sort of, I'd have about the forgiveness and things like that, that if somebody is just indifference and there's a connection of forgiveness that could occur, but it still could be better. So there is still a positive connection, but it would have been better if the person did help in that circumstance. It would have been a stronger, more positive connection.
Yeah, so I think so. So you were suggesting, okay, there are two possibilities. One of the possibilities is that each individual evil is conducive to soul building, but you think sort of the better theory is that the broad, or sorry, not soul building, is ideal for connection
Yeah.
building. But the better theory is that kind of like the broad structural features of the world are conducive to connection building.
And it's better that God doesn't intervene all the time, because that would defeat the purpose. If God were intervening all the time, then that would defeat the purpose of us being responsible for what happens to each other. And so there wouldn't be room for those positive or negative, positive connections.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, so then the challenge is that it becomes there's a sort of plausible story to be told about why having connection building, having evils that we suffer and go through, are is valuable because it builds connection. But the thing that's somewhat puzzling is that it seems like you could have a world with much more finely tuned evils where there aren't these universal regularities that produce all these evils that are not all conducive to connection building. You could have a world where God sort of introduces evils strategically so as to be maximally conducive to connection building. Maybe he doesn't have those evils that are kind of bad for connection building, like evils that make it harder for people to spend time together and forge valuable relationships. And so then I think the thing that you need for the argument to work is you need not merely that evils are connection building, but that the broad structural features like natural regularities are connection building.
Right. Well, I think you do need that, but I think, and those, I mean, to work alone, and I never purport this as to stand necessarily a standalone theodicy, but to work alone as the only thing on the table for a theodicy, then you would need to argue that the broad structural features are necessary, the regularities, and then usually people say, well, that allows for choice, that we wouldn't, if a world that maximizes ability to choose intelligently and see the consequences of your actions is going to be one that has regularities.
Yeah, one sort of thought along these lines, and this is sort of a theodicy that I've been thinking about that I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on. The idea would be that what's valuable about the universe that we're in is that God wants to put us in a universe that we're capable of understanding the broad features of the universe. So we're capable of having moral knowledge, for instance, and we're capable of having scientific discovery. So maybe God would reveal himself because it's important for us to have broad theological knowledge. But other than that, the universe looks roughly like a typical godless universe without God. So the idea is just as, a person, it's sort of similar to what people say about hiddenness, where just as a person's, relationship with their future spouse might be strengthened by spending time, living without their future spouse, where they can see how much worse things are. Similarly, maybe our relationship with God would be strengthened by sort of spending time in what a typical godless universe looks like. And then, you get to all the arguments about building our connection with God, which is very valuable. And then it's able to explain all the evidence for God, which depending on what people think the evidence is, it all comes in the form of either things that are required for us to exist at all, or for us to exist as, conscious agents, like, the harmonious psychophysical laws, fine-tuning, discoverability. It's able to explain that. And then it's also able to naturally predict all the evil because it has everything that's explanatorily virtuous about the hypothesis of indifference, minus the fact that it poorly explains lots of things.
So it's a little like one of the virtues of often the soul building theodicy is claimed that soul building requires that we be ignorant of God's presence to a certain extent, right? God can't be immediately obvious that God is present to us, because that would inhibit our choice between good and evil, much like if the police officer, you see him in the rear view mirror, you don't have the choice anymore, being the law for its own sake. But you add to that, I'm just trying to understand your theodicy, you add to that a sort of, we appreciate the good things more if we experience what a world would be like without God. We appreciate that relationship with God more. Is that right?
It's that God puts us in a universe that looks like a typical universe without God, except for, so he provides the sort of necessary features for us to exist. He finely tunes the universe so that we exist and are capable of the broad kinds of knowledge. But other than that, there's something particularly valuable about us being in a godless universe. So, you can make a similar argument, like the thing you were talking about soul building. There might be some unique kind of soul building coming from having survived and lived in a universe that actually is what a universe would look like apart from God. Where, if you spend all this time in heaven, sort of like, connected to God, there might be something especially valuable about having spent some time, gone through the struggles that would be what things would be like apart from God. And then it also might strengthen your relationship with God.
Right. So I wonder about that. Sometimes I bring that possibility up in class. I call it the appreciation theodicy, right? So you need evil things to appreciate the good. It's a little bit like what goes under the name of the necessity of contrast theodicy. You wouldn't know or appreciate the good unless there was evil. So then I wonder about that is, why couldn't God just directly give us that knowledge? So what's your response to that?
So I don't think it's not just that we sort of understand. So imagine, think back to the case with the spouse. It's plausible that there's something especially valuable about two people being in a relationship, where imagine two people are going to enter an infinitely long relationship. There's something valuable about a person having spent time outside of the relationship, even if they could the knowledge of what life would be like in the absence of the relationship could be directly sort of propositionally put into their brain, because it's sort of similar to what you talk about in the connection building theodicy, where there are certain it seems like there are certain metaphysically necessary connections, certain metaphysically necessary things that increase the quality of a connection. So even though God could perhaps make it so that all people begin in heaven with the knowledge that the person would have helped them out if they'd put them in the world, would have taken a bullet for them. There's something especially valuable about it actually being the case that the person was willing to make a sacrifice for them, rather than them just having the knowledge that they would have done it.
Right. So it's particularly valuable that you actually have that experience. So there's experiential knowledge, and the experiential knowledge has a value beyond propositional knowledge, which is all you would have otherwise without the actual experience. And maybe that having that experiential knowledge allows a deeper connection with the good of God, the relationship with God, or having good things occur. And can you give examples of that in, I guess you gave the example with the relationship in ordinary life, so you make it plausible, like versus somebody, if they could convince you how bad it would have been apart from that, it becomes, you sort of understand just from our own experience that it really helps that you actually experienced it. Now, another question I have on that regard then is that just a contingent feature of our psychology, or do you think that goes metaphysically deeper, that we need that experiential knowledge? So could God have constructed us in such a way that the movie time, here's what it would have been without me, or do we need to actually experience that?
Yeah, well, so let me make a few points. One of them is that I think a similar thing would apply to your theodicy, because you could say similarly, is it metaphysically necessary that us struggling, maybe you could have beings that are psychologically constituted differently, such that they such that they were able to understand at a deep level that they had that the other person would have had they undergone shared struggles together. The other person would have engaged in major sacrifices for them.
Right.
The other point, and I think this is what makes the theodicy attractive, is even if it's slightly hard to motivate, which I don't think it is, it just has such great explanatory power, where it basically it naturally predicts all of the evidence both levied for and against theism, where once you have it in place, it explains all the evils of the world, and then it also can be used to explain the argument for theism. So even if it was slightly unmotivated, even if you had to posit maybe there's an unknown reason why God puts us in a universe like that, because it just explains things so well, it would be worth positing. And then the last point is, it does seem like maybe there is something especially valuable about, imagine two cases. In one case, a person watches a PowerPoint about how much life would have sucked without their wife, and then immediately enters a relationship with their wife. And in the other case, the person actually lived life, and they sort of they spent various years kind of pining for not having someone who they felt really understood them, and then finally find their wife. It seems like there's an important sense, not just in the sense that there's an important sense in which the second relationship is deeper, in which there's greater connection, and so a similar thing might be true of God. You also might think that kind of like our relationship with God is slightly mysterious. He's very different from other beings in the universe, so maybe there's something different about the way relationships work there.
Well, this is a very interesting theodicy. I see what you're saying about the explanatory power is that if you get everything you would if there were an indifferent God, you get that were truly indifferent, you get the fine tuning, and assuming you can explain the fine tuning with the indifference thesis, but if you do think God's indifferent, you at least can explain, don't have a problem with the evils occurring in the world because they just seem to be the result of the way the natural laws.
Yeah, well, just to be clear, the idea is that not that God is completely indifferent to us, but that God places us in an indifferent universe. So it still accounts for
Right.
fine-tuning, because for us to be in a universe, it has to be finely tuned.
But God's not completely indifferent because they're not being a God, only partially. But you say, like a lot of people have a strong intuitive sense there's a God, and throughout most of human history, that's been the case.
Well, so the idea there, so remember, it's not just that he puts us in an indifferent universe. He does two things. First, puts us in an indifferent universe, and then he puts us in an indifferent universe where we're able to understand the broad contours of the world. So that way you can get the modal knowledge argument, you can get the argument from scientific discoverability, and you can explain the fact that so many people feel a relationship to God, because being aware of the theological dimension of the world is an important bit of the world. Now, that does lower its prior probability a little bit, but I think the way it lowers that prior probability, it makes up for it dramatically in explanatory power. And it's still a fairly simple thesis. It posits basically that the world that God wants us to be in for a small portion of our life, 70 years out of our infinitely long existence, is one where the universe is broadly indifferent, but we're capable of having knowledge of the broad categories that exist in the world.
Right. Have you published this anywhere?
No, I haven't. I've written about it on a blog, and I think maybe I'll write a paper about it at.
Right, yeah, why don't you go ahead and do that and then send the paper to me, because I have some friends who would also be willing to look over this. It sounds an interesting theodicy. Interesting, and I haven't seen it before. So,
yeah, I appreciate it.
Looks like it has a lot of potential. Does it? Now, you explain that so this is like an addition to the connection building theodicy. Is that how you're conceiving of it? Like there's particular connections that occur that it strengthens certain kinds of connections with God and maybe other people to experience what the world would be like without God.
I think that the things said in favor of like a lot of other theodicies can be kind of subsumed slightly under this theodicy, where the part of the motivation, like part of the reasons why God might put us in a universe like this, can be explained in terms of the other theodicy. So there's the connection building version. You might build connections in certain valuable ways. That one's, I think, the most plausible. It can co-opt the skeptical theist explanation, where you say, maybe there's a reason we don't know about. And, it becomes less implausible, because now you only have to posit one unknown reason, where there's an unknown reason for God to do just this one thing. It can co-opt the soul. There is something plausible about the idea that, going through and struggling in a universe like this is, particularly valuable for our struggling and overcoming and so on. But yeah. So one other question about
I think the indifference hypothesis, though, I just want to say, I think the indifference still is really not explaining every particular evil, explaining the the world structured this way and why God doesn't intervene.
Yeah, right.
So it does the same thing as that one I was saying about the connection building theodicy, explaining the structure of the world and then adding, why doesn't God intervene? So so it's not like every single evil is being explained by indifference.
Right.
It's the evils are explained, like, why does a hurricane happen? well, the world's structured according to regularities, and then you might explain why it's structured that way using your indifference hypothesis. But then
Yeah.
the actual evil or disease is explained um, by the regularities. And then I guess you answered the objection, why doesn't God produce the alternative um, evil fine-tuned world that fine-tunes it for connections?
Yeah. You answer that, and you also like it. uh, You have, I think, a more plausible explanation where, like, putting us in a universe that's broad, in a universe that looks roughly like a typical godless universe, there's at least a
Mm-hmm.
plausible story to be told about why that would be very valuable. One contrast, there's a plausible story to be told about why, having broad regularities where the features of the world are sort of broadly, generally
Mm-hmm.
predictable. But I think it's harder to see why, there are a lot of worlds that you could have where there are regularities, but where they contain less evil or different kinds of evils. Um, you could have very different fundamental laws. And so I think you get a slightly better explanation of, and then you also get an explanation of why God doesn't intervene, where can't intervene. If it's a God doesn't intervene in godless universes. And in the rare cases where he does intervene, you have an maybe if you're a Christian, you think becoming incarnate as Jesus, you have an explanation of why he does intervene in that case, because he's willing to make an exception from the rule of in different universes to provide us with knowledge of the broad contours of the universe and being aware of who the creator is, what his nature is, etc. That is, an example of
Well, why do you
awareness.
need all these terrible evils like the Holocaust and other things to know that the world is indifferent? Couldn't it be one that is structured, or God even intervenes? There's not all these terrible evils, but you would still think there was no God. I mean, if these really terrible evils didn't happen, um, wouldn't you still think, because you don't see God directly, you don't see the intervention occurring. So you
Yeah, well,
see most things are just explained normally, but like we're built with a deeper psychological structure that there's such a strong disinclination to do those sorts of evils like happened in the Holocaust. Let's suppose we were built that way psychologically, then they just wouldn't happen or very rarely happen.
yeah. Well, the
And
idea
you
is,
would still could think we were in a different universe. So how would you deal with that kind of objection?
So the idea is that God wants to put us not in a universe that merely looks indifferent while we are in it, but he wants to put us in what a typical godless universe looks like. So he does, makes the universe be such that it's able to have us, but beyond that, he's not doing fine tuning. Why is this? Well, you might think that sort of like all the motivations for the argument apply to to this, where it's like maybe there's like think back to the spouse case. Imagine that your spouse was sort of like behind the scenes tampering with things to minimize the extent of your heartbreak prior to you finding them. You might think it's sort of like the thing that's valuable about it is decreased if the person's working behind the scenes, where the thing that's valuable is about basically your life being such that you exist in a world that broadly is apart from them. And so a similar thing is true with God. You also might think that a world that actually looks not just like the best kind of godless universe, but that a world that has the properties of the typical godless universe with the small modifications that God makes, that's particularly conducive to soul building.
Or to connection building.
Yeah, soul
So
building or connection building, or
yeah, then you'd have to argue that
that's our,
that particular kind of world is conducive. I don't think the typical world, I don't know what even that would be, because the world has so many features um, that are atypical, right? You could imagine worlds that didn't allow for those sorts of evils to occur. Um, had much stronger psychological constitution, or vowed for a lot more of those kinds of evils. There was a lot less inclinations towards good in the world. So I'm not sure there's any way of articulating in any kind of um, precise way, at least, what a typical world, a usefully precise, but a typical godless universe would look like. So, I mean, I'm just trying to raise, I think your idea is really intriguing. I'm just trying to raise some objections and
Yeah,
not
yeah, I
say it's
appreciate it.
wrong. I'm just raising some objections when I start thinking
Yeah,
about it now
yeah.
off the top of my head.
Yeah, so I think that's true, right? So it might be hard to have a typical world. So I mean, one thought that I've toyed with is maybe God sort of like has basically has like a random number generator that sort of like determines the qualities of the world. Where because the idea is that the thing that's valuable is sort of like God broadly not meddling. And so if he's in the process of sort of tuning the world to be such that it minimizes the number of gratuitous evils, that broadly interferes with the valuable good, where all the other goods like soul building, connection building, etc., are downstream of this broad feature of the world, which is God not meddling except in rare cases, namely bringing about the world at all and bringing about the conditions required for agents who are capable of having knowledge of the broad contours of the world. Um, so,
What I'm
uh,
seeing, go ahead.
yeah,
What I'm seeing is how you could add as a condition, using this as an additional condition for good connection building, is it cannot has to seem somewhat indifferent on the surface that um, God is not directly involved. But I think that is very plausibly true, because if it seemed like God was directly involved in that undercut motivation for R actually um,
yeah.
helping people and doing things.
The idea is not just that while we're in the world, we should while we're in the world, we should not be aware that God's in it. The idea is, in the afterlife, presumably we'll have much more knowledge of the features of the world. And the idea is, even then, we should have, even once we have a deeper understanding, when we're experiencing the beatific vision and maybe having access to God's knowledge or something, depending on on theological views, that even then we should not think that God was in the process of meddling with it. Um,
Why would that be important? Because God's is sustaining the entire world in all of its structure. So why is it important that we, in the afterlife, we know that God wasn't arranging for this experience of, because that um, the experience of their being God being indifferent, or a world without God, because isn't the experience of that what's important, not the actual truth of that?
Well, it is the experience of that that's important, but part of it is the experience of that in the afterlife. So it's not just that it's important that while it's happening, we have the experience. One of the goods that I argued comes from this is soul building, and so there might be something particularly valuable about the soul building that comes if you know that the evils that you were exposed to were essentially a random assortment of evils, were the types of evils that you would be exposed to apart from God, rather than that it's this finely curated mix of evils that God happened to approve of that was optimal for your moral and spiritual development. It's also possible, this is just a thought I just had, maybe maybe that having God be in kind of broadly disconnected from the evils of the world makes it so that it strengthens our relationship with God. Where if kind of
Mm.
like if God was finally curating all the evils that you were exposed to, then you might be sort of bitter and resentful about God. Um, uh,
Right, that God didn't curate them in a way that was most conducive for you, or something like that. Is that what kind of you're thinking?
yeah.
Why you'd be bitter? So I've thought of this idea before of, like, if we're to be co-creators with God, we're to work with God.
Sorry, you cut out for a moment, and I missed the last like 10
Okay,
seconds.
I thought of this idea that if we're to be co-creators with God, we're to work with God in helping prevent evils and make a better world. Then you would need those evils and what happens to be independent of God's orchestration, because then it would be kind of a fake um, co-creation, right? God wouldn't really be working with us to prevent it, because God was the one that arranged for there to be that particular evil. So
Yeah,
there'd have
that
to be
that's
a certain amount of randomness to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think that that can help bolster the Odyssey.
Well, I'd
Yeah,
like to see yours written up, and you can send it to me, and then I'll pass it by some friends of mine. I guarantee you, we won't steal it or anything from you.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
I'm not
no,
worried.
you'll get credit for it. But I would think it would be if it works out and you could get this published, that would be a real bonus for you.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. So,
So motivate you to write it up, and then I'm good at thinking of objections to things. So
yeah, yeah. So, so in your paper on connection building, so one objection you address is that if a lot of people are in hell, then it's sort of hard to see how we have connection building. And you say, well, maybe this is a good reason to reject annihilationism or infernalism. So, are you a universalist?
what I'll say about by universalism, I think it's the most. I mean, I'll confess I don't know for sure. You know, the issue of free will and things like that, but I think a very plausible case can be made for it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
So, and
pretty.
I think from scripture, I think even from scripture, I think even a strong case, maybe the strongest case can be made from scripture because there's Christian scriptures. There seems to be a lot of scriptures that point in the direction of universalism, and the ones that don't can be easily explained away, I think, as problems with translations of the word eternal.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's Ionios, which very often does not mean eternal. Um,
Right.
yeah,
Of the ages, have pertaining to the character of the age to come, which could then be thought of as the one age when God's will is fulfilled.
yeah,
So, so I think there's a lot of plausible um, arguments for universalism. The only thing that gives me a little hesitation is the idea of, you know, would God have to override our free choice to achieve this? And how does God, would that disrespect us as persons?
yeah. I mean, I'm not that worried about that objection because I think that rationality would require us to choose the good. It would require us to choose God, given that it's infinitely better than not choosing God. And so God wouldn't have to override our free will any more than you'd have to override a person's free. God doesn't have to override our free will to get people in heaven not to like stab themselves in the eye for no reason.
Right,
He
right.
just
Because
needs.
but do we have a free choice to be aware of the goodness of God? Is that where the free choice comes from, or to be remain in willful ignorance of it? Because agreed, once we were aware of how good it was to be in that relationship with God, there's not any external compulsion to do
Yeah,
good.
but that seems like the kind of thing where uh, it isn't an objectionable overriding of our freedom. Where I think you get to override a person's freedom certainly if the following two conditions are met. First, or three conditions. First, overriding their freedom will be conducive to an infinite good. Second, it'll be better for them in the long run. And third, in the long run, they'll approve of you overriding their free will. And all of those
Right, right.
conditions are met here, right? So if a person wants to like if a person wants to like remain in the dark and not be exposed to the knowledge that will later convince them that something's a good idea, then it doesn't seem like that's a valuable kind of free will.
Well, that's
Where
what I've said, about this whole one of my responses to that objection is that who's going to complain? The person whose will is overridden is not going to complain. Um, us who freely chose God on our own are not going to complain because there's some value of doing it without being forced, of the free choice for it. And certainly God's not going to complain because God wants everybody to be saved and God wants the good for everybody. So what's you know, the other alternative, in other words, is always worse on all fronts of not
yeah,
doing
right.
that.
Yeah. And
And
even
there's also the other, idea I've been toying with is the idea that um, we came into this world, we pre-existed somehow and chose, at least in the general contours, to be in a world like this. So under that idea, and I'll show you how it's related to the this whole universalism issue. But one thing it explains is what I call the victimage problem or the lack of consent problem people have with evil. That I was to say, born in a terrible circumstance. I never consented to all this stuff. So God put me, where I was assaulted, raped, etc., and I never consented to it. And there seems something, even if it was for the person's greater good, there seems something wrong with, causing a person or allowing a lot of suffering when you could have prevented it for that greater good. But if the person consented to it, then there's not that kind of violation.
Yeah.
If for the whatever goods like connection that could be achieved. So that seems a way you could answer this other problem that it's been maybe the last 10 or 20 years people have been really pressing on. Not that there isn't a greater good, because you can't really show that. That's what the skeptical theist says. You can't show there's no greater good. But in all good, God just simply, even if there was a greater good, wouldn't allow a child to be tortured or raped apart from their consent. But maybe they did consent to it. So
Yeah.
it solves that aspect of it, but it also feeds into an argument for universalism, because there you're giving somebody maximal free choice. They have freely chosen to be here, and um, then in these general circumstances. When if God didn't do that, you would be taking away their free choice of the circumstances they were in. So if you're an anti-universalism stressing free choice, how important it was, then that runs contrary to deny a kind of consent to this, runs contrary to your entire position. How can then you object to God overriding our free will? Because we never freely chose to be in the circumstances we're in. If we had consent beforehand, no one would consent to a situation where they are liable to eternally be separated from God, without a backup plan, right? Of their will being overridden or something like that. So either path, you get to a kind of universalist conclusion, and you negate that overriding free will objection.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's all
So
right, and I think that's helped with preexistence, but it also I don't think it requires preexistence for a reason that I think you explained nicely in a conversation you had with Tom Jump and that I watched, where you pointed out that okay, maybe if a person consents to something that's valuable, but also if a person later, if you know in advance that a person later would consent to
right,
it, and it's like whose
yeah,
harm. And so similarly, if a person, and I think that's especially plausible when we think about how great the goods in the afterlife might be, where if you have a good in the afterlife that outstrips the harms of this world as thoroughly as true love outstrips the harms
right,
of scraping your knee, then it becomes more plausible that if a person later is happy about the sufferings that they went through in the world, or being placed in a world like this where they go through these sufferings, and the goods that it's conducive to just are like unimaginably good, then it starts seeming more.
yeah, I agree. I agree. That's your second option. You don't necessarily need at least actual consent. Actual consent would be better, but would-be consent might be sufficient. But if you agree that would-be consent would be sufficient, that also feeds into an argument for universalism, because if God overrode your free will, then you would have freely consented in hindsight that God do that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
so if God placing you in this bad circumstance being born in, because you would have consented to it, doesn't violate something essential about you being a person, um, something essential about the consent requirement, um, of that you didn't consent to it, then neither would God in the end overriding somebody's free will because they just got fixed into a bad path.
yeah, yeah.
So I
I think
think you can also, that argument can lead into a kind of negate that overriding free will objection. So I think there's quite a few different answers to that overriding free will
yeah,
objection. But as a philosopher, I never want to say, okay, I know this to be true. I think there's intellectual humility. So it seems to me a very plausible case can be made for it.
Yeah, I did. Universalism is one of the, if theism is right, universalism, that's one of the philosophical views I hold like most confidently, because it just seems like all the arguments against it are just very unconvincing. Um, and
I agree
yeah,
with that. There's not really good convincing arguments against it.
yeah. So okay, so one of the things you're one of the leading experts on fine tuning. So the most common response that intellectually serious people give to fine tuning is that they say, well, maybe there's a multiverse, uh, and then if there's a multiverse, then it's no surprise we find ourselves in the universes that contain life. That's where all the people who are alive find themselves. What's wrong with that objection to fine tuning?
Well, I mean, I've raised several different objections to it, apart from the fine tuning for discovery. So, one objection to that is that the multiverse generator itself would need to be fine tuned. Even and intuitively, that seems kind of obvious. You have to have a set of just the right laws, etc., that produce many universes, and then adjust let's say, the fundamental parameters of those universes so that at least in some of them it came up just right um, for life. So that's one of the problems with it. And the models we have of that, that are the speculative models like combining inflationary cosmology with superstring theory, you actually do have to fine tune those models in order to get um, a multiverse that will generate even one life permitting universe. So that's one of the issues. And it also doesn't explain the fine tuning at the level of laws of nature, unless you have a meta, a thing that generates laws. Um, uh, if you had that, then you would have explain the fine tuning, or you do like David Lewis, all possible realities exist. Well, then, of course, reality that allows for life like ours is going to exist. So that's one of the if you have a universe generator model, then you run into the fine tuning at the level of the generator.
Yeah,
If you don't have like a David Lewis kind of model where all possible realities exist. The other, of course, is a much discussed Boltzmann brain problem, which is really the problem of it seems like being what I call a fluctuation observer, an observer that exists and is surrounded by chaos, not one that can interact with other observers, is far more likely under any kind of um, natural measure you could put over the space of possibilities. You would have to put a very arbitrarily fine-tuned measure over the space of possibilities to make that not the most likely outcome, to have an organized world in which there's um, other beings we can interact with, which is the kind of world we find ourselves in. So the multiverse gives the wrong predictions. And then third is all this material, the fine tuning for scientific discovery, which I'm convinced of now is correct. And it's quite fine tuned for that. And if so, that's not explainable by the multiverse because the multiverse requires not only there being many universes that are varied, um, some of which varied enough, so some of which allow for life. So that explains why there's a life permitting universe. But the multiverse requires something more to explain why we find ourselves in such a life permitting universe. And that is because the observer selection effect, that's the only kind of universe we could find ourselves in.
yeah.
And but that observer selection effect doesn't work for the fine tuning for scientific discovery because we could have found ourselves in universes that aren't nearly as good for discovery as the one we're in.
Yeah, so I wonder. So I think that. Uh, so in terms of the first point, I think those points are all really interesting, and I think they're all broadly correct. But in terms of just the first point about how you need fine tuning for a multiverse, so the way I think about fine tuning, there are sort of two distinct features, like parts of the fine tuning argument. One of them is this broad conceptual point, which is it's very difficult to get a physical system to produce anything interesting. In order to make, for instance, John Conway's Game of Life, you had to design these really complicated
Right.
rules and work really hard. And then there's So there's this sort of conceptual point, and that I think big problem for a multiverse. And then there's also this mathematical point, which is if you look at the parameters in physics, they're in this extremely narrow range. And given that your prior probability that you assign to each of the possible parameters of a constant should be roughly equal by sort of indifference reasoning, that means that the prior probability of a world like ours is, like best case scenario, like if the fine tuning in physics is right, less than 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd for
Right.
right? And so I think the multiverse, it is clearly subject to the first objection, and that's a really big problem. That it's just the prior probability of any physical system that produces a bunch of universes. That it's like saying, oh, there's bread on the table. Why is there's bread on the table? Can't have been a designer. So we're going to posit a bread making machine. But why is there a bread making machine? That's even more complicated than the thing of bread. But I think so. But I still think it's the best best atheistic reply, because it avoids, you can't show with the same degree of precision just how improbable it is. So maybe maybe it's like 1 in a few thousand is the prior, but it isn't the same type of 1 in like less than 1 in Googleplex or something,
because you can't quantify it in the same way. So it's a lack of quantifiability of the improbability in a way you can at least if you use an indifference measure, you can do it under the standard fine-tuning argument. So you'd have to just say the laws, we intuitively think the laws are very improbable, which, even having regularities, I wrote a paper, it was like for Philo in 2009, God and the Laws of Nature, why I think the very regularities of the world really present a problem for atheism, why there's regularities at all. I think that there's, what I do is there's a regularist theory that they just happen. There's no reasons the world continues being regular. And even a lot of the regulars admits that seems like a cosmic coincidence. And that's pressed by a group called necessitarians who think there's underlying necessities. But I show in that paper is the necessitarians without theism, that they run into the same cosmic coincidence problem. And so really you have to go to something like theism if you're going to solve it. And it does seem to me just completely, it seems to me just absurd or ridiculous to think that the world behaves in this regular way for no reason. So masses always attract each other, and they could have done otherwise, but they just always happen to do that. And then on top of that, the regularist has to assume that think that there's no reason why they have done it, but they'll continue to do it. And that seems even to add to the absurdity. If you really thought there was no reason to begin with for why there were these regularities, why in the world would you think it would continue? Just like if you think if I flip a coin 10 times in a row and it comes up on heads, and I think there's no reason, I wasn't weighted, I shouldn't expect it to continue. So there's this whole other problem with when you actually start addressing the laws of nature, that I think is actually a powerful problem. That there's this kind of regularities at all, and especially ones that are intelligible, which feeds into discoverability.
That's all interesting. So you have another paper called something about extraterrestrial intelligence and the incarnation. So in it, you argue that there would be at least a decent probability that God would make not just humans, but would make a whole range of conscious creatures engaged in sort of valuable projects. And you argue that this doesn't conflict with the incarnation. So I'm wondering, I think this could be made into a powerful argument for God in two ways. One of the ways is best case scenario for atheists is that in explaining fine tuning is that there's a multiverse. So that means, but if theism just predicts a multiverse straightforwardly, then that means that the best case scenario for atheists is that we discover something that confirms theism. Where, it would be like, imagine if like the explanation of fine tuning is like, well, we can get out of fine tuning by saying all the atoms have made by God written in them. That somehow solved this fine tuning problem. Well, that would be good news for the theist, because
Right.
theism naturally predicts with, I mean, it doesn't predict it with very high probability, but it predicts it with way higher probability than atheism does. And the second way, and this is something that a friend and I are working on a paper on, is that so in anthropic reasoning, there are different views of how to do it. So anthropic reasoning, for those who don't know, it's like how to reason about your own existence. And
Right.
one view is called the self-indication assumption. And so the idea of the self-indication assumption is a view that predicts that there are more observers is
Right.
more plausible. You should treat, if one view predicts n times as many observers, all else equal, you should
Right.
treat your
Right.
existence as confirming that by a factor of n. But so that means that if theism predicts with decently high probability that some like huge, uncountably infinite number of people would exist, then it'll fit, and naturalism predicts that with a probability of basically 0, where even if you can get an infinite multiverse, you can't get a multiverse with the higher cardinalities of infinity people, then that'll majorly confirm theism, if that view of anthropics is
So the
right.
discovery of a multiverse, there's many, many other realities. One disconfirm theism. It's perfectly compatible with theism, as long as those. If now you might think those other realities, if they were a lot of horrible worlds, that there was lots more suffering than this world, and that would present a problem for theism. Like this world is structured so that we can discover things, that we're not simply stuck in a kind of Stone Age, really bad, brutish kind of situation. So if
Yeah,
there were evils, if there were worlds like that, then that would disconfirm um, theism. But just the multiverse itself does it. But I'm not sure it confirms theism unless you can show that such a multiverse would be improbable under atheism, but
right,
much
right.
more probable under theism. So
Yeah,
that gets back to the fine tuning that the multiverse that they're hypothesizing in terms of if you don't go with the David Lewis route, um, requires fine tuning, and then you're claiming they invoke the multiverse to explain the fine tuning of the constant, so they try to negate that theistic argument. But
yeah,
then the theist comes back and says, well, your hypothesis, first of all, there being a multiverse doesn't disconfirm theism itself if we discovered that. But your hypothesis doesn't negate the strongly confirming, the strong confirmation of theism over atheism, cuts to fine tuning because you'd need fine tuning again.
yeah,
So all the role of that, you just note that theists shouldn't be adverse to a multiverse. It seems plausible under theism,
yeah,
a
yeah.
right sort of multiverse.
Yeah, so that was the first point about how, theism predicts with decent probability a multiverse. So if we discover one, it's good news for theism.
Right.
But the second point was that we actually have according to this, based on anthropic reasoning, we have a reason to think that there's a multiverse, and not merely a multiverse, but we have a reason to think that there's an infinitely large multiverse, and
Right.
not
Right.
an uncountably infinite, with uncountably infinitely many people. And then if that's true, it's very difficult to rig up a story of how you get uncountably infinitely many people on naturalism, and it's certainly much higher probability on theism, especially if, and as I'm inclined to think, there's no set of all possible people. So there is a collection of all possible people, but it doesn't comprise a set. For any set of any cardinality, the number of possible people is greater than that. If that's true, well, there's no naturalistic picture of how, unless you think, believe in David Lewis's view, there's no naturalistic picture of how you get, unsettly many people.
Of course, you wouldn't be able to know that there was that, so it wouldn't be evidence that could be used for theism. So
Wait, sorry.
your question
Sorry,
is hypothetical. If you knew there were uncountably many people, then that would support theism over atheism.
No, the
But
idea is
there's no
that
way we could know that.
the idea is that we do have evidence that there are uncountably infinitely many people based on anthropic reasoning. So the argument claims that the view of anthropics, which says more people existing is more, makes your existence more likely, that view is correct. And then if that view is correct, then from the fact that you exist, you should think there are a lot of people. And the more there are, the likelier it is. And so a view like theism that predicts just, some with at least decent probability, some just ungodly, or I guess godly many, some really enormous number of people ends up getting a big probabilistic boost because it makes your existence much more likely.
Well, I mean, that the problem I have with that, it doesn't make your particular existence more likely. It makes it more likely that somebody will observe themselves as existing. So that very general fact becomes more likely. But how does it make your particular existence more likely?
Well, if there are I think it does in just the standard way that having more of something makes it likelier that any particular thing will arise. If you pick up more numbers from a hat, the odds of picking any particular number will be higher. If you create more people, the odds of any particular person being created are higher. And then there are also arguments, and maybe
I see what you're saying, but yeah, then you would have to be the odds only get higher if that you create all the possible people. Otherwise, the probability of you being created would be there's an uncountably many would be zero. So you're saying if God creates every single kind of individual there could be, then that's what you're saying.
Yeah, so I think so the argument, if you think God creates all possible people, then it's like, okay, then your existence is probability 1, and if not, it's probability either 0 or undefined. I mean, maybe this would go too much down a rabbit hole, but I'm sort of inclined to think that you can do probabilistic. Like, imagine you're considering 2 possibilities. Okay, possibility 1 is in Hilbert's hotel, 100 rooms are painted red, and in probability and hypothesis 2 is that only 1 room was painted red. Suppose your room gets painted red. It seems like, even though it's hard to put maybe the probability of that is 0 or infinitesimal, it still seems like there's some important sense in which it favors the 100 rooms being painted red hypothesis. And I think you can show that basically, like, to do anthropic reasoning, to get out of all sorts of gnarly paradoxes, the best way to do it is to say that if you deny this, then you get weird results where you can predict a chancy event in advance based on you can predict the results of a coin flip based on the fact that if it turns out some way a bunch of people would be created, that just a theory that predicts that there are more people being created is more likely, even if they both predict 0% of the possible people get created. But if you do think that unless all possible people get created, then the odds of your existence is 0. Well, that's great news for theism. Theism is the only view.
But then even with that, the odds of you as a particular person interviewing me as a particular person, that reality can only that's incompatible with you not interviewing me reality, right? And each of those, so if you have an infinite number of people, if once you group them 2 by, these people intersect here, then that's still going to have 0 probability.
Well,
unless you think there's an infinite number of interviews that you do all the way into the future with an infinite number of different philosophers.
Yeah, well, so I think so for that, that's about once you exist, the probability of any particular state that you might be in. Now, that doesn't affect the probability of your existence, right? Your existence is more likely if there are more people. But so I don't know if the odds are 0 because, if you think that the probability of being in an indifferent universe or something is high, and then there's only a finite number of indifferent universes or something that might be created, maybe the probability of being in a state like this is finite, not infinite. But if it is infinite, here's an analogy. Imagine you randomly selected and maybe this is metaphysically impossible, but imagine you randomly selected just a random number from the number line.
Right.
The probability of selecting any particular number is 0. But imagine we're considering 2 hypotheses. So hypothesis 1 is, okay, so this is going to be a weird analogy, but so there are infinity people. They're all put to sleep. and then a coin's flipped. If the coin comes up heads, then every person is woken up and they all select a random number. If the coin comes up tails, 10 people are woken up and they all select a random number. It's true that the probability of selecting a random number, whichever one you select, is 0. But because it makes it more likely that you would wake up at all, then that fact favors it. And then the other fact is equal between the two hypotheses. And so that one doesn't.
I mean, the danger you run into there is being selective about the facts. If there's an infinite pool of facts, then you can cherry pick the facts that favor a hypothesis. And there'd be still a lot of facts that don't. So you'd have to have some way of randomly picking the facts to get around the cherry picking objection.
Yeah, well, the idea is that you would the facts. I mean, you could account for all for the other facts, but they don't affect the updating because they're equally predicted on both hypotheses. So the facts that you take into account, and this is just the way that we standardly do Bayesian reasoning, where it's like there are a lot of facts that both theism and atheism make really unlikely, that we would be having this conversation, but because neither of them make it less unlikely, that's not thought to favor either hypothesis. And so I think the same thing applies with probability zero events. But in contrast, if there's an event like your existence, which is likely on theism and is very unlikely on naturalism, then that'll end up favoring theism.
Right. If there's it's somehow that has to stand out in a certain way that you're not just cherry picking the facts. Like the fine tuning stands out in a certain way. It's not like here's a kind of example of where I worry about cherry picking. Like it was in the discoverability domain where Guillermo Gonzalez and Jay Richards. I don't know if you saw the book The Privileged Planet.
No, I remember you mentioned it in your paper on discoverability, but I haven't read the book.
Yeah, but they would say, okay, look at this feature. Look at how good this is for discovery or this other feature. But it always seemed to me, well, you can always, in any universe, you could probably find features that would be good for discovery. But it also seems you could find features that aren't. So there'd have to be some way of negating that cherry picking objection. Now, the way I do it is I independently just vary the parameters and see what happens. So I'm not cherry picking how, see if if in a chance universe, you'd equally likely get, by varying it would become less discoverable as it would be, or more discoverable as it would become less. So that kind of negates the cherry picking. If there's a rigorous method of doing it that's indifferent to whether the result is the way you want it to, that supports your hypothesis or not. So I just worry about it here. Maybe there's a good answer to it. I worry about it. I also worry about what is your definition of a person? How do you characterize yourself as different from somebody else? Is it like a quantitative characterization, where there's no shareable properties, qualitative properties that differentiate you, or are you differentiated from others because of your, let's say, the some set of qualitative properties, your genetic code, or something like that?
Yeah, well, so I think there are different accounts of personal identity. I think you're a soul, but I think on any account, the same kind of anthropic reasoning is broadly going to be correct, where more people existing is more likely. So I'll give you an example of why you should accept this anthropic reasoning. So imagine that so there are two people, and then they play a game of poker, and if they get anything other than a royal flush, then they'll have an infinite number of offspring, or it doesn't have to be infinite. They'll have Graham's number offspring, and if they get a royal flush, they won't have any offspring. So they exist, and then they play the game, and then if they get a royal flush, no offspring. If they get anything else, they have Graham's number offspring. So imagine that you So you and one other person are sort of sitting around, and you don't know if you're the first two people. You could be the first two people. You could be any of the later people. You reason in the following way. You think, if we are the first, so if there are Graham's number of people in total, the probability that we'd be the first people is 2 over Graham's number, which is basically 0. While if we are, if there are only 2 people total, the probability that we would exist is 100%, or that we'd be the first 2 people is 100%. And so, as a result,
given that we exist, given that we exist, it would be conditioned on that. It would be 100%.
Right. And so your reason, if we ever find out that you're the first 2 people, then you get very strong evidence that there won't be Graham's number of people. Then you find out that you are the first 2 people. Now you're confident that there won't be Graham's number of people, which means now you're confident that the game of poker that you haven't played yet will have a royal flush, because if it didn't have a royal flush, it would create a lot of people. And yet that does not seem like the way probabilistic reasoning should work. It doesn't seem like the consequence you should assign to a future chance event should depend on the number of observers that will be created if the event turns out.
That's all that goes, those are the doomsday arguments and things like that, that if the world would continue on, it's not going to end soon, then we find ourselves close to the beginning. That's only going to be true if the world's going to end soon. Otherwise, we should find ourselves, way off, because there's going to be way more people into the future than there is. I mean, those are the much discussed doomsday argument. Here's a case. Go ahead.
Sorry, just very briefly. The idea is that if you adopt the self-indication assumption, it cancels out the doomsday argument, where with the doomsday argument, it's true that if there are 10 times as many people, the odds I'd be in the first 10% are 1/10 as great, but it's 10 times as likely that I would exist, so it cancels out the doomsday argument. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, sometime. I'd have to think through those. Those always bothered me intuitively. They these kind of doomsday arguments or these self-indication assumption arguments. Now, how you would deal with a case like this, so I toss a coin and it comes up 20 times in a row on heads. That seems really improbable. And you come along and you say, oh no, nothing, and I want to infer it was weighted. It's way more probable that would happen if there were, many, many more people all flipping coins. So, and that just, that argument is clearly, I think, wrong. Just because you add huge numbers of people flipping coins is not going to change the probability that this particular coin came up heads. So, explain to me how you're getting around that kind of argument.
I think that argument fails because, so I think that works against aversion, a view similar to SIA, but it doesn't work against SIA, where the idea would be that it's true that if there more people makes it likelier that I would exist, but once I exist, the probability, like given that I exist, the probability that I would get 20 heads in a row is much, it's very low if it's rigged. So once I exist, positing other people doesn't affect the probability that I, in particular, out of all the people who exist, would get 20 heads in a row. So as a result, what you should think is, you should think both things. You should think that there's an infinite number of people, but that the coin's rigged.
Right. Now, and when you say I exist, that's a really strange proposition. Are you thinking of yourself quantitatively as there's something, a unique defining property that's not shareable that picks you out? Or is it a qualitative set of properties?
So I don't know, and I guess I don't actually. The thing that's relevant isn't so much you in particular. It's not so much like your like soul existing. It's more like this particular person slice at this time having this experience exists. So like the same kind of self-indication assumption reasoning also applies to within one person. So are you familiar with the Sleeping Beauty problem?
Yeah, but I couldn't recall it right off my head, but I'm familiar.
Yeah, so the idea is a coin's flip. If it comes up heads, you wake up once. If it comes up tails, you wake up twice. And so if Upon waking up, and if you wake up twice, the second time you have no memory. Upon waking up, what should be your credence in the coin coming up tails? And so what self-indication assumption people generally say is that your credence should be 2/3 in the coin having come up tails.
Right, because
Because
it's twice as likely that you would be that you'd wake up, you'd be awake.
right. At this current moment where they say the probability that it's heads in the first day equals the probability that it's tails in the first day, which equals the probability that it's tails in the second day. So you should be at 1/3. So it applies so it's not just with like persons that exist. And so I think for that reason, it doesn't depend on persons. It's about the total number of time slices.
Yeah, I would have to, I guess I've thought about this long ago when thinking about the kind of this universe objection and whether I bought it or not to the multiverse. But I guess I would have to look through all that again, because it gets into a lot of these subtle points, I think, about indexicals and general descriptions of things. So certainly if you describe something generally, right, without any indexical, like a coin came up 20 times in a row on heads, then that's going to be more likely in a multiverse. Many, right? If there's many times this occurred. But then when you bring in the indexical, I observed it coming up 20 times and had this particular coin, then it isn't. So there's all these tricky issues, I think, with indexicals. How do you refer to yourself? And is it a general description or a specific description? At least that's my sense of things on this without looking more detail. And I know this has been much discussed, so I'd be interested in your take on it if you have your a paper on that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to send it.
So is there anything else you want to talk about?
So in terms of fine tuning for discoverability, so just for people like me who don't know any physics, and people like presumably most of the people in the audience, like how sort of firmly settled is the fine tuning for discoverability? I know you sort of think it's right based on your analysis of the physics. Have there been a lot of other people who have looked at it and come to the conclusion that it's broadly correct?
No, I would say that's where I have to get my work out.
Okay.
So but there's been some other physicists who've looked at some of the cases, or quite a few of the cases I had it, and agreed with the calculations. But it isn't widely accepted yet. So this is very new material. What is more widely commented on is that the universe, in terms of not the quantitative constants, not the parameters, but in terms of the general law structure, seems awfully good for discovery. Like that's Eugene Wigner, Albert Einstein, Mark Steiner. Many people have pointed that out. But what's unique about my work is that I'm looking at the fundamental parameters and varying them.
Yeah, that all makes sense. I mean, hopefully more people look at it so that lay people like me can.
But I'm convinced of it now. I mean, and I'm a pretty skeptical person. I'm convinced it's really there and real. So, but I need to still get all this work out. So, and I know how long that kind of thing takes. So I wouldn't, 5 years from now, maybe it'll be more accepted, but new stuff takes a long time to get accepted.
Yeah. So one thing I often hear from people about the fine tuning argument is they say, well, maybe if you change one of the parameters, then you wouldn't get life. But if you sort of change a lot of the parameters in big ways, then maybe you could get life of a radically different kind. Does this just get the physics wrong? What do you say about that sort of objection?
Some of the, if you have independent cases, then the objection's not going to work very well. Like, masses of protons and, neutrons, their ratio and whether you could get carbon production in stars is going to be different from the case of the cosmological constant, which is whether galaxies form at all. And so they're about independent processes. And so adjusting one of the things is not going to change whether, like, once you get galaxies and stars, whether you can get carbon forming is not going to be affected by changing the cosmological constant, because that has to do with a local cosmological constant, has to do with the large scale structure of the universe and whether galaxies can form, and then stars can form. Where this other parameter I'd mentioned has to do with if the stars had formed, what would happen, which the cosmological constant only has to do with whether those stars form. So there's a chain here you have to have. First, you got to get the galaxies and stars forming. And that's not determined by this other stuff, but by the cosmological constant has to be fine-tuned just right, regardless of what this other stuff is. And then once you get the other stuff in place, because the cosmological constant's right, you get the galaxies, then this has to be right as another link in the chain. So you've got this link in the chain, and then you've got a second link in the chain. And the first one depends on the first one. The second depends on the first one being right, but you can't adjust the first one and make it where galaxies form, and you don't need the special adjustment of the second one. So a lot of them are they're about independent processes. When they're about independent processes, you're not going to get that kind of interdependence that allows for a different set of values. Now, ones which you would get when they focus on the same process would be like the strength of the electromagnetic force and the strong nuclear force. Well, it's the combination of those two that give rise to there being, carbon, the level of carbon you need, and level of carbon and oxygen. So then there'd be a set, you might vary the strong nuclear force and not get it, but then you could vary the electromagnetic force and be back into a region where you get it. So that's the kind of general responses. You have to look about which constants, if they're about independent processes, then they're pretty much going to be independent. If they're not, then the dependency problem comes up, and you can only talk about joint ranges.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Robin, thanks so much for coming on. I think this is
always a stimulating conversation. So where are you at, just about your own, if you want to shut off it being live, we could talk off the record if you want.
Sure. I mean, I guess I could answer that on the record, and we can stop going live. So
okay,
I'm in my second year at university studying philosophy at the University of Michigan. So I'm going to be in Oxford next year studying abroad.
Okay. Well, you're a pretty sharp guy. So send me the stuff. Or do you plan on going on into philosophy?
Yeah, I think so.
So send me the work you have, and I'll distribute it, to other people I know. It'd be great for you getting a job in the future if you had a publication or so as an undergraduate.
Yeah, thanks. That's very kind.
Because your work is up my alley, and I know other people that, there was this Rutgers conference last summer on fine tuning that talked a lot about the self-indication assumption. That were people that were really into it.
Wow.
Two people at UCLA. I'm blanking on the person's name, but almost there. But anyhow, I could, send it on to them, and they're more likely to look at it if I send it on to them than alone.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's unbelievably kind. And I mean, you're like, so, for a while I was an atheist, and I thought atheism was just like ridiculously obvious. And over time, I've sort of, drifted quite substantially in the direction of theism. And now I'd say I lean towards theism. And your work was a major reason for that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear about that. So both the problem of evil and the fine tuning.
Mostly the fine tuning stuff, but also the connection building theodicy to some degree.
Okay.
Did
you know about the fine tuning for scientific discovery, or is that just something you recently ran across of mine? Or
yeah, I mean that's part of it. I mean, it's that sort of helps to kind of like just add to this general sense that basically, like, there's this sort of sense that a person can have where it's just like, okay, once you say there's a multiverse, problem solved. And it turns out that's just not true. You have to jump through, several hoops. First, you have to explain the whole low entropy stuff, where it's like,
Right.
that make it so that there aren't, a million Boltzmann brains. And then you also have to explain, the like the the you also have to get through the fine tuning for discoverability. It's just you get this, there's a lot of hoops that you have to jump through, and then even after you jump through all of those, the multiverse just has the problem of it's like, why is there a multiverse? It's like explaining why there's the bread by saying there's a bread making machine. That's not probable.
Right.
Maybe we should end the live stream, though. I'd be happy to keep chatting.
Okay. Yeah, you can end the live stream if you want, and we could chat afterward. I could send you a link to some other work of mine if you might be interested in it.